It gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Uli Brandt here today. And there's no one better suited, certainly, to say something about him professionally than our dear friend and colleague, Alexandra Trost. Thank you, Alexandra.
Thank you very much. We are at times of severe multiple ecological crises and that demand radical changes in several fields. In this context, I'm very glad to introduce Professor Uli Brandt in this Justice Lecture series. Professor Dr. Ulrich Brandt has been Professor of International Politics at University of Vienna since 2007, and he is head of the Department of Political Science there and also of the Research Network Latin America. He is not just a guest at our institute. In 2016, he worked at the still IASS at that time as a research fellow on a famous book that probably many of the people that are here today know, which is called The Imperial Mode of Living, Everyday Life and the Ecological Crisis of Capitalism, together with Markus Wissen. And for the last 5 years, he was also member of the ISS Scientific Advisory Board. So it's great that you made the way to Potsdam from Vienna to be here today. And I'm so glad to welcome Professor Brandt, since he has dedicated his academic research and also his activity strongly towards facilitating knowledge for just socio-ecological transformation pathways. In theory, it is now a consensus that we cannot go on with the unlimited appropriation of resources that our imperial modes of living are built upon. Nevertheless, many responses to the ecological crises don't take into account the social structures that produce and continuously exacerbate it. Therefore, I consider that Professor Brandt makes very valuable contributions by researching and publishing on the liberal globalization, its governance and crises, on critical state hegemony and regulation theory, international and environmental and resource policy, NGOs and social movements, and Latin America. He was expert member of the Enquete Commission, Prosperity, Growth, Quality of Life of the German Bundestag from 2011 to 2013 and is co-editor of the journal Blätter für Deutsche und Internationale Politik. So thank you very much for being here, and the stage is yours. Yeah.
So good afternoon, everybody here, offline in presence and online. I'm really happy to be again here at RIFS. Many thanks for the invitation, especially to the whole focal point, to Alexandra Trost and Niklas Schäffler, and for all those who made this possible. I'm currently working on a new book, if you like, Imperial Mode of Living 2 with Markus Wissen. And I wanted to present, this was in the announced title, some thoughts on eco-imperial tensions, which will be in the light of the current war, of the corona crisis, of the so-called deglobalization, a new Cold War, etc., etc. A focus, but we didn't have the time to develop it so far, so I won't go into this today, but hopefully, or maybe at other occasions, we can discuss it. I took the opportunity after I got the invitation to look more systematically into the concept of justice and to link it a bit to my work, to my own research. I'm not a philosopher, but originally I wanted even to look more closely to moral philosophy, which is of course very important when it comes to justice questions. But yeah, I read a bit, but I didn't feel comfortable enough to present here some thoughts. So I will reflect a bit on the very concept of justice, but not from a philosophical perspective so far, and then to link it a bit to my own work. So it's work in progress. I presented here for the first time, and I'm very keen to get here in the room and also from the online audience feedback. Last week, the Academy for Social Ecological Transformation took place in Vienna for 3 days, attended by 160 invited people from trade unions, workers' council members, the Chamber of Labor, academia, as well as social movements. The Academy was coordinated by the Chamber of Labor, and it was a year of intense preparation. I myself was member of the steering committee, And it was supposed to bring together different groups with their perspectives, sound out commonalities and differences, reflect recent experiences, and develop joint initiatives. Among others, the chief economist of the Chamber of Labor, Markus Materbauer, spoke in the opening discussion and referred to recent studies by Lukas Chancel, who shows how unequal global CO2 emissions are. In this famous Nature Sustainability article at the end of September 2022, Chancel shows that between 1990 and 2019, the bottom 50% of the world's population along income and wealth emitted 16% of global emissions, while the top 1% caused 23% of global emissions. The World Inequality Report 2022 shows that in Germany, the materially rich 10% of people emit 34 tons of CO2 equivalents per person and year, while the poorer half emit 5.9%. And this is well known here. Markus Materbauer, in his opening speech, pleaded for more social justice, which is to be achieved in particular through stronger taxation of wealth and income. And the state and public investment should play a central role in social ecological transformations. More equality and justice, he argued, are good for climate protection. But as a trade unionist, he did not formulate the goal and concrete measures of a far-reaching transformation of the patterns of production and living. He sticked to the question of wealth, of income, of taxes. So it was mainly about redistribution with hopefully positive effects on the climate. So this statement, this experience from last week frames a bit my lecture. I would like to offer a few reflections on the concept of justice and show that on the one hand, the term is very important, but on the other hand, it is also quite vague and it's used in very different ways. So for about 15 years, and I'm sure that you had already talks on this, in Germany, around the time of the protests against the Group of Eight, the G8 summit in Heiligendamm, and then in the preparation of the COP15 2009 in Copenhagen, the movement of climate justice has been constituted through protests, demonstrations, blockades, and other means. It wanted to draw attention to the completely inadequate climate policies. And as of 2019, the movement has picked up speed again with the founding of the Fridays for Future, and we all have the current actions of the last generation in mind. But if we take a closer look at the statements, the understanding of justice remains quite vague. This is why this series is very important. The organizers consider three justice demands to be central, close to Nancy Fraser's considerations and others. Firstly, those along the distribution, justice issues, along the distribution of the costs and benefits of ecological problems such as climate change and accordingly of transformation processes. Let us think here of the direct benefits and indirect costs of flying, of automobility, but also when it comes to transformation processes, of the implications for material prosperity, distribution, or jobs. Jobs in particular in those sectors, such as the airline or car industry, that have to be heavily downsized. The second type of justice demands are those that concern decisions and participation in restructuring processes. Who decides, for example, that RWE can continue to mine and burn lignite? Who decides on the conversion of the car industry to cars with electric engines, or on the dismantling of this industry? The answer is often, it's the investment decision of the companies that have to pay off. And it is people's consumption decisions that lead to more or less sustainability. In addition, that there are direct democratic procedures, such as deliberative or participatory democracy. So this is, after all, what RIFS also is researching in the programs, in many programs, and under the header, who can have a say in the transformation to sustainability. And the third type of justice claims is recognition claims, which groups are recognized as right holders, affected, or particularly vulnerable. And on the video of the RIFS homepage, which introduces the focus, emphasizes one dimension of injustice, which results from and stabilizes historical and current North-South relations. So this is up to discussions. My impression is that your interest is very much, when you talk about justice, about global justice, when it comes to North-South relations. Unjust and international power, decision-making and knowledge relations, colonial hierarchies, etc., etc. But also in this video, it remains unclear what is precisely understood by justice. And in an encyclopedia, Bastian Vilenga sees the demand for justice as self-evident in social movements. This is also my impression as you take it up, but at the same time, theoretically controversial. A comprehensive demand for justice is kind of an epitome of a new society liberated from oppression, exploitation, and exclusion. But it remains quite vague. So my first point is that we have to acknowledge that the term of justice is often used in a quite abstract and vague way, but it's also a contested term. And this is why I think it's so strong that social movements that contest oppression, exploitation, and other things, they use it to formulate their claims. However, I would like to problematize the concept of justice here in this lecture. On a general level, justice can be understood as a normative standard for appropriate human action to claim universal validity. Do not harm others, do not kill, do not destroy the natural foundations of life. But, and what is also very important, and I come back to this at the very end, the concept of justice is characterized by the fact that the normative standards for people's action claim to be generally binding, allgemein verbindlich. In principle, they should apply to everyone. However, the concept of justice or demands for justice are not only iridescent, the term has a positive connotation, but as I said, it's quite abstract. What is exactly understood as by justice? So, to put it bluntly, with the demand for justice, one is not necessarily on the right side. This may be surprising, because if we look at the history and current practices of environmental justice, for example, with the EJOLT project, Lea Temper was here presenting the EJOLT work. This is somehow right, resistances, alternatives, and in this case, it might be quite obvious to be on the right side. But behind the supposed universalism of justice claims, there might be, and then some problems start, particular interests, not universal interests. There might be behind claims of justice relationships of power and domination that can be inscribed in the demands. For instance, when trade unions demand justice, but in doing so, they simply demand more of the existing wealth for the workers, they might ignore the destructive dimension toward other countries and regions, as well as towards the natural foundations of life. So a trade union, this is why I started with Markus Materbauer, and I work a lot with the Chamber of Labor and trade unions. There might be this insufficient understanding of the ecological dimension of the multiple crises, as Alexandra introduced at the very beginning. And even when we think about more, let's say the last 2-3 decades, the meaning of justice is very often used in a sense of a merit-based justice, Leistungsgerechtigkeit. Those who achieve more should also have more. This is a very powerful and dominant understanding of justice in our society, complemented by maybe by the demand for justice of opportunities. That means that the social conditions should be created that all people have similar opportunities in life, and that the latter do not depend on the level of education, and that they have a good, that they get a good education, that they get good healthcare, etc., etc. But with this claim of this justice of opportunities, the starting point, the unjust conditions are not really questions. It's just that we have unequal, unjust societies, and then some conditions should be improved to reach this through this justice of opportunities. And even I go a bit further. Some of you might remember 22 years ago, after the terrorist attacks on the Twin Towers in New York on 9/11, 11 September, the US President Bush proclaimed not only a war on terror, but he promised infinite justice. And even in the current war, we should, as it's not the topic of my talk, the aggression against the Ukraine, it would be interesting to look more precisely who justifies the own actions in the name of justice. It's to deliver more arms or to deliver less arms, so it's quite complicated. So to end this first thought on justice, and then afterwards we will discuss it, I would go even a bit further. The currently dominant and destructive mode of production and living, if you like, an imperial or the capitalist mode of production and living, also in a sense claims to be just. It's surprising a bit. But if you look at the look at the dominant understanding how our economies work, it's an understanding that the capitalist commodity exchange is that of an exchange of equivalence via contracts. So it's supposed that those who own a commodity and sell a commodity, if it's labor power, it's a normal commodity, it's a service. There is kind of also an understanding that this act of a commodity exchange is in a sense just. It's supply and demand. So my point here is that the use of the term of justice by social movements is to challenge powerful forces, the age-old experience, if you like. But justice is also used by others, and it's part of a dominant understanding and of dominant practices of capitalist societies. So the Viennese historian and publicist Franz Schandl puts it in a tradition of critical theory, and quite provocative. That's an article by him in the weekly Der Freitag, beginning of this year. Justice is unjust in capitalist societies because the demand for justice draws the unease about societal conditions and relations to the ground of morality. So that we come to a field of morality and might hide the very social structures, the very social conditions of injustice. So it's not about the problematic social system itself that needs to be changed, but at the best about repairs. And this is a bit, I don't want to criticize him too much, but in a sense of Markus Marterbauer quoted at the beginning. So to avoid any misunderstanding, I think that the concept of justice as a demand is very important, but we have to look at these ambiguities, or as the philosopher Theodor W. Adorno said once, for him, justice, criticizing moral philosophy, justice for him is an impulse. I like this one. It's an impulse of and in people's everyday experiences that are highly unjust, that are full of exploitation, that are experiences of exploitation and injustice. and that the concrete experiences, this was always Adorno's point in his philosophy, the concrete experiences of people are the starting point of politicizing a justice agenda against existing and perceived injustice. And this is also, of course, then when it comes to environmental justice movements, etc. But Adorno goes a bit further, I think. It's not just the social movements, important enough, I come back to this at the very end, but it's also the very experience in society. And if we think through this, we might broaden a bit the perspective on justice. And science, social sciences, interdisciplinary sciences, transformative sciences can help to understand why it's so difficult to create a sustainable society and the conditions for a good life for all. It can analyze the vested interests and domineering structures and processes, the deep hegemonic entrenchment of the existing mode of production and living. This was my first thought. I would therefore like to further develop the notion of transformative justice. You introduced this, with Lea Temper, this important distinction between it was not affirmative, affirmative and transformative justice. When it comes to transformative justice in the sense of structural changes and not of moral claims. This is a distinction. I wanted to go a bit deeper, but as I said at the beginning, I didn't have the time to really digest what I read. We need an understanding of these structures and the associated logics, interests, and power relations. The structures, the societal structures, and even the societal nature relations, those structures are not simply there in a positivist sense, but they need to be scientifically explored in inter and transdisciplinary research. This is my second argument this afternoon. And these insights in structures, these contested or varying insights in societal structures, in societal logics, must be then brought into socio-political discussions to create spaces of reflection with stakeholders, with societal actors, as we did last year in Vienna in this academy. Let's see. I want to make my point. Referring to three dimensions. The first is let's take the example of economic growth. And I want to draw your attention to this ambiguity when we talk about societal structures, because they're not there. It's our work, our scientific work, to detect them. It's ontological assumptions, but then of course it's also empirical work. Markus Marterbauer's perspective on distribution policy, mentioned at the beginning of this talk, takes up an important experience. This is an ambiguity, an important experience of modern capitalist societies, that economic expansion not only satisfies capital interests, but also creates scope for distribution so that states and employees and normal people also benefit. If expansion and thus capital investment does not take place and capital accumulation, we have one thing above all in capitalism. So if the growth engine does not work, we have one dynamic under capitalist conditions, which is crisis. And this in turn also usually dealt with on the backs of the weaker, of the workers, of the wage dependent people. But this is precisely what we do in our work. We need to criticize, to problematize the logic of growth. It needs to be changed in time of the transgression of planetary boundaries. So the compliance with planetary boundaries is not only achieved through an exchange of energy sources, but through a fundamental transformation, and this is the work here at RIFS as well, through a fundamental transformation of the existing mode of production and living. It requires a dismantling of certain industries and corresponding consumption pattern, infrastructures, etc., which is not easy in terms of societal justice. This is my point. Martha Bauer is not let's say, going so far in this talk, at least, into this direction that he doesn't want to give up societal justice. This is his point as a trade union intellectual, but he avoids to go deeper and to really question the dominant mode of production and living. So in this context, it's important to understand more precisely what the drivers of the growth machinery are, which are socially ambiguous, Martha Bauer, and ecologically more and more destructive. Then we talk about the disposal of capital via the investment condition with the aim of making profits. So this is a logic, this is a structure which is very powerful in society. And profits are currently still being made by the fossil fuel industries. At the end of March, many of you know, the British initiative Influence Map published a study according to which in 2020 and 2021, the 30 largest listed financial groups invested $740 billion into fossil energy projects and services. So this is a structure which let's say struggles for justice need to be need to confront those interest groups, those structures, etc., etc. And these extraction of fossil fuels are often accompanied by violence, displacement, criminalization of resistance, etc. This is again a reference to much work on resource extractivism, environmental justice movements, and so on. So my first point is that usually when we talk about transformation, and even when we talk about a just transformation, the dominant paradigm, I would say, is still a green growth paradigm. Is still a paradigm to have efficient technologies and others, and is not to question this. And then this is our work, and then we have to defend it publicly and also within the scientific communities, why growth and even green growth is or might become a problem. And this is my first point, has to do with the capitalist conditions, with the structural power of capital, but also then that it opens up distributional spaces for workers, etc., etc. But if we talk about transformation, we should even pay attention to conceptual precision. I make this point very short, and then if you like, we can discuss it. In earlier contributions, also, I wrote the article here during my fellowship time. On the transformation debate, I've referred to this debate, and I criticized the majority of the transformation debate as a new critical orthodoxy, intending to emphasize the tension between a very broad and a very radical diagnosis of the problems of the ecological crisis and the need for change, and a quite institution-affirming idea and proposals for change. So the state, I come back to this in a moment, the state, the market, the growth logics are not really questions. And I would say this is very important when we want to further push an agenda on a research agenda on justice. Scientifically speaking, there is a lack of a more precise understanding of the, if you like, object of transformation. What should be transformed? We have to understand this with scientific tools, society itself, but again, societal nature relations. They are not just there, but we have to understand and then to do research against this background. I already hinted earlier that this more precise understanding of capitalist structures and the links to permanent growth, environmental destruction, etc., etc. But I want to further my argument and pointing at two other dimensions to make clear what do I mean when we talk about objects of transformation that need to be changed. The first, the dominant understanding of society is that the sustainability problems are primarily economic ones, namely ecologically unsustainable production and consumption. So this is a bit if you like, the theory of change. Yeah, we have companies, private public companies, we have consumers, they need to change behavior, consciousness. But the master tool, if you like, from this dominant perspective to promote change is politics, is the state, are the adequate framework conditions. So these framework conditions have to be changed through financial incentives, rules, even bans and others. And in this theory of change, the public or civil society actors are kind of have the task to produce pressure. Yeah, a bit what we experience now with Lost Generation and others. Consumers are, in particular, are seen as having relatively high degrees of freedom in deciding whether to consume green or not. So I hope you get this. This is kind of a model, of course, very, very simplified of how, from a dominant perspective, from a, if you like, evident perspective in society, the problems are conceptualized and changes thought. And then the international level comes in, the FCCC, the CBD, they should also create the framework conditions for adequate change. A critical perspective highlights that global capitalism is characterized by the contradiction that more social justice can certainly be fought for in individual countries, but we need to understand that it takes place under conditions of global competition and thus tends to exploit other countries, their people and their nature. So the point is, much of the debate on even radical transformation, social ecological transformation, remains on a national scale. They imagine Germany, maybe the European Union, but they don't look at a pressure, at a constellation, at a structure, even if you like, of a global competition, not only among companies, but also among nation states. Which we see now with the Inflation Reduction Act, the competing, if you like, blocks to foster their ecological modernization in parts, but also then to exploit other countries. So this is why many of you, and Alexandra already announced it at the beginning, many of you might be familiar with the term imperial mode of living. We introduced the concept imperial mode of living. We are very happy that now we have, the book is translated into 11 languages. The Arab language translation just came out. And what we want to understand is the interconnectedness of the global conditions, the global structures, the political and economic structures, and everyday practices of people, companies, state policies. So this is, if you like, an attempt to shape our understanding of the very structures. It's not just the state, the companies, the consumers, civil society, but to approach the problem of unsustainability from another angle, if you like, from a more comprehensive angle, and then to shed light on particular structures and processes that we consider decisive to understand the broadly accepted, hegemonic, if you like, and practically produced unsustainable mode of production and living. I leave this here, and of course, in the debate, we can come back to this. A third dimension, a third example, if you like, I'm a political scientist by training, and is that also we need theoretical, ontological work, and then, of course, empirical studies, methodologically sound, on the very understanding of the state. At the beginning, I said Markus Materbauer called for a stronger state to deal with the climate crisis via public investment. And this is quite understandable after decades of neoliberal politics, the pushback of the state and the weakening of the socially more vulnerable people. We could call this a state reformist perspective. And the current movements for climate justice, in my opinion, have also, in a sense, a naive understanding of the state. The last generation, for example, wants to attract attention with their actions in the form of escalation, of a strong provocation. And at the same time, they address demands such as speed limit or the reintroduction of the €9 ticket in Germany. But the actor who should do it at the end is the state. And this is, if you like, a liberal understanding of politics of the state, that through public pressure, as I said before, we push the state into a certain direction. And what we can learn, and this is now a critical perspective, and again, this is our work, our scientific work, the insights of a critical state theory, critical state analysis, that the state is not an autonomous or neutral regulator beside or above society, and also not the international political institutions, but they are first an active producer of the crisis. The state is heavily entangled with the unsustainable societal, economic, political structures. And we have to understand this. The state, I would say up to now, is structurally overburdened with the necessities of social ecological transformation. Just an example, as a tax state, a state that reproduces itself via financial means that come out of a growing capitalist economy for now. Or the state that secures international competitiveness for the own enterprises and the own location, den Standort, and if necessary, at a high ecological and social price. So the state is not something aside, a regulator, but we have to understand how it is, without giving up that, of course, the alternatives changes are necessary and also in a sense took place. We might come back to this in this discussion. But first of all, I would say we have to understand the state, the role of the state, the function of the state in a capitalist society, in a growth-oriented society. And we can see that the state is not homogeneous. This is a second very important insight from critical state thinking and state theory. We can see in the current disputes of the German federal government that and the different ministries that the state is not homogeneous. It's full of contradictions. And that the state and the bureaucracy itself is that we have struggles within the bureaucracy, among the ministries, within the cabinet, over the overall direction of politics. And I think this is also a very, very important line of research, not to assume firsthand that now Habeck and Lindner and Scholz are the only or the top players of politics. But what we should do, and this is my research, also my plan for the next years, to look into the engine room, in the machine room of politics, how this works, what are the orientations, the desires even of bureaucrats, of state officials, maybe to change something towards more sustainable relations and policies, or maybe not. Yeah, because they have other interests. So this brings me, and then I finished this thought on this, how we approach from a scientific perspective the society, yeah, the evident, which is not at all evident when we look in more detail on it. Debates about the state are mostly about state action, in political science terms, about policies. But there's in a sense, a tendency towards a politicism that the state can change, I said it already, can change via adequate policies, the societal dynamics, economic dynamics, behavior of people. It's kind of as assumed super subject, if you like. But it is not. So this is what we have to understand, that the state needs to be understood in relationship with the dominant forms of societal, of economic reproduction, of forces. This again comes back to this insights that the study on the fossil investment, that it's still powerful, and that is also backed by the state. And finally, as far as the international dimension is concerned, we have to deal with the fact that social justice has historically been organized mainly in the countries of the global north through the welfare state. And the welfare state is, of course, it's a bureaucratic, it's in many cases authoritarian, but the principle of the welfare state is really to be defended because it secures for many, many people better living conditions. The welfare state is a result of historical struggles by workers, by women's and feminist movements, even by environmental movements when they brought their concerns to the terror of the state. But as I said, this from a more analytical perspective, we have to consider it's not only the welfare state in Germany, but it's also a welfare state in Germany, which is kind of taking advantage of an imperial mode of living, of the exploitation of people and nature elsewhere. So I hope that I could make my second point, that part of a transformative research is really to understand and to theorize and then to apply a more sophisticated understanding of society, of the state, of North-South relations, of the very economy. So I come to my last thoughts. It should have become clear that I do not want to give up the concept of justice. For the time being, we don't have a better one. Maybe in the course of this series, you come to a better and more plausible concept. But for the moment, I would defend it. Of course, we need to think also in terms of justice. I think it's important, again, to use Adorno's words, to understand the impulse from people, from social movements, from progressive parties to change the unjust conditions. And the concept of environmental justice, of course, refers to the ecological dimension. So my point would be, we have a vague and abstract, not very precise understanding of justice, but the common denominator, and this is very important, is that the unjust, the ecologically destructive social relations have to be changed. Yeah? And if you like, beyond this common denominator, then the problem or the trouble starts. But these conditions, again, are not simply there. They must themselves be critically understood in order to change them. And I have to elaborate this with the examples of the capitalist growth economy, the imperial mode of living, and the critical understanding of the state. I end with the unsurprising thought that the entry into a fundamental social ecological transformation is first and foremost through diverse social ecological conflicts, critical of domination. And we have, you already had in this lecture series many examples. Yeah, it's material infrastructures to resist against resource extractivism, to push certain concrete alternatives. So in this way, the self-evident can be attacked. Spaces for alternatives can be created and the limits problematized and proposed. Alternatives can be proposed. This also shows, especially in the series on sustainability and justice. If we want to use our transformation or transformative research to advance a globally climate just, or more generally, just society in a normative sense, then research on social movements or radical research on social movements is very important. So social movements, again, I come back to Lea Temper and the whole, if you like, the whole starting point of in the 1980s in the United States, the whole starting point of the reflection and the concept of environmental justice. And it's our research, and it's to understand better what is really going on. However, environmental justice should not be reduced to the really existing or still emerging radical social movements. Environmental justice must play a role in workplace disputes. Again, the Chamber of Labor conference, in the startups of new companies and branches, and even in state policies. So my proposal would be to broaden and to look also at the actors, maybe in other words, but they also claim to create a juster society. I hope that you get it. It's the link between environmental justice and social movements, radical social movements, to me appear too close. They are the starting point, but we should enhance our perspective and to understand why, if you like, in the engine room of politics, in certain branches and companies and others, there emerge an understanding of justice. And this is also the precondition of allies. Some of you might be familiar with this very important alliance between Verdi, the public workers trade union, and Fridays for Future, that they were claiming, they were starting a process together. So in this sense, the conflicts are not only the resistance from above against capital investment, against certain state policies, but the conflicts are conducted on many terrains, also on the terrain of the state and within the state apparatuses, within companies, interest groups, the public sphere, even in the artistic sector, in everyday people's everyday actions. So to broaden the perspective. But then, and then I really close, one criteria, which is also, I would say, underestimated in the debate on environmental justice or climate justice, is that the necessary radical social ecological transformations need binding political rules and social norms. I come back to this idea of that the claim of justice is something universal, not universal in this Western sense, but universal. It's not only a claim of a particular group, important enough, but if we think in a societal change, we need to think how can claims, experience of justice, of change, of transformation be put in a framework which is binding. Yeah, and this binding character to me means political rules, societal norms. This is also when the last generation wants a speed limit. A speed limit is a rule, a societal rule, which in principle should apply to everybody who uses a car on the street. Klaus Dörre from the University of Jena, for example, speaks of a transformative law. I find this he's a sociologist, but I find this a very interesting concept. I don't know if you already had here a lawyer, so in this. Oh, okay, then okay, great. So Dörre argues in this idea that we need the binding rules, the binding political rules, the societal rules. He argues for a transformative law. But as I said, and this is an ambiguity, and I don't have for now a solution for this. At the one hand, now I claim that in thinking in binding rules, the state is a central instance, a central entity to push this, to secure this, to sanction this. But at the same time, I criticized the state to be very much linked to dominant unsustainable structures, and I think we have to, at first hand, we have to accept this ambiguity, even if you like this contradiction, and then to deal with it. So justice in this sense is not just a claim of resistance movements, as I said, and the bottom-up construction of alternatives, a long debate I have with the Barcelona folks, Yorgos Kallis and others, but it's also a global societal principle which needs to be institutionalized in norms and rules, and then also in experiences, in practices, in narratives, and so forth. And this, if you like, global principle of justice as an institutionalized practice, then can change the living conditions towards a good life for all, and also needs to be complemented with the subjective preconditions that really people want to live this life. Yeah, the problem of the imperial mode of living is that it's kind of also subjectivizing people, that they want more and more and more, then also how to change this. I leave this aside. So the important demand for environmental justice, climate justice, is linked then to the very concrete and livable experiences, coming back to Adorno, his his starting point to take seriously not only the big struggles, social movements, last generation, the state, repression or change, but he says we have to look at a space, at a collective experience of people to live differently, to live without a car, not to want to eat cheap meat, not to fly because it's for 20 euro to London. And so it's not to moralize it, but to have an experience that this is not part of a good life. And in this is why the studies by Lucas Chancellor and others are so important. Despite all the mentioned deficits, they impressively articulate the displeasure, the discomfort of people with the socially and ecologically unjust conditions. And this is an entry point for, if you like, a broader understanding and broader struggles for justice. Thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you very, very much, Uli, for an absolutely fascinating, a really wonderfully rich interrogation of justice, which was so multifaceted, so multi-perspectives, various layers also traversing various different disciplines as well. And I'm sure that this will lean itself to a very rich discussion. A quick note on the logistics. Anyone here in person, if you wish to pose a question, please just come up here to the front and you are welcome to speak in the microphone. And then we will turn to the online participants as well. If there's anyone online with a specific question, please just raise your hand online and we will get to you. Mark, please.
If we're on now, yes. Yeah, thank you, Uli, for that tour de force through numerous aspects of what we need to think about in terms of social justice and sustainability. I want to ask maybe a thought-provoking question before I have to leave, which is, can you imagine a world without nation states? Maybe taking apart the question of how we would get from where we are to where that would be. And would you imagine that that world would be more conducive to fulfilling the types of sustainability goals that we've set, or less conducive to it? And what would that mean? I mean, how would we even think of it? And maybe one other base question to that: would the existence of a single group that wants to put themselves into the state of a nation state obviate the capacity of the rest of the world to exist without being a nation state? Very interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you very much, Mark. Perhaps, shall we take one other question and then we move to the answers? Yes, please.
Yes, thank you so much for this very rich talk. I have many questions, but maybe we can talk about this later. One thing that struck me, you were talking about this sense of justice being having to be supported by binding norms. Intuitively, of course, that makes sense, but at least from a perspective of political philosophy, finding one term of justice is impossible, right? There's so many ways of understanding justice. So this is usually when I try to think about it, and I'm curious to hear whether this was something you also considered, to focus on something like participatory forms of justice. I think you mentioned recognition, these kind of aspects that allow broad pluralist values, different conceptions of justice to enter into the debate. And that seems to be a way of dealing with questions of justice. But my question would then be, to bring it home, so to speak. So I'm from Austria originally. We just had elections, and very famously, we're heading very far right in many aspects. And that seems to be a way of how people perceive what justice is, right? I'm sure the far right people think that their perspective of how to live the world is just. Or maybe they would even say, well, maybe the sense of justice is important, but even more important is my perceived sense of security or whatever that is. So how do we deal basically with, that's my question, maybe this is good to be answered by political science. How do we deal with the fact that the way that we perceive justice here, also in academia, for example, might be very different from what the traditional working class person understands as justice? Is there a way around that apart from deliberation? How would the binding norms help us to deal with that? Thank you.
Super question. Thank you.
Wow, these are two additional talks. Thank you, Mark. One answer could be now for 200 and almost 230 years valid from 1795, Eternal Peace by Immanuel Kant. And he argued eternal peace can be secured by a federation of states. We need we won't have a global state, but he was keen enough in the midst of the revolution wars in France to understand that we need something above the state, which then was afterward, which is today the United Nations. But we need to take from the state its structure of domination. And this would be a way of my answer. First of all, analytically, we need to consider that historically, the system of nation state is quite young. Yeah? Benno Teschke, some of you might know, he called it the myth of 1648, the treaties of Osnabrück and Münster, where the principle of the nation state was installed. But the history was full of empires. Yeah, throughout the 19th century, even after the second world, the Soviet Union was an empire. Of course, Britain was for a long time an empire. And some argue that in 1989, the principle of the nation state was then or 91, with the end of the Soviet Union, this was installed. So the nation state obviously is a very powerful form to organize the resources of a society, of a capitalist society with much more of identities and others. But a way, or a kind of an opener to a short answer would be to this. Yes, I can imagine a world of competing nation states, and I would distinguish between a state which is organizing our, let's say, our living together. And the nation, as Etienne Balibar argued, the nation is kind of an ideology to have a feeling of belonging. And I can imagine that this feeling of belonging is not necessarily the nation, but it goes down. It's Potsdam, it's Brandenburg, and it's the world. Yeah, it's the cosmopolitan citizenship, the idea from Kant, Ulrich Beck, Habermas. Yeah, very. But then we need forms of organizing us via forms of the state, which are also at different scales. So this is, in this sense, I can imagine a world where this tight relationship between nation as an identity, Balibar, and the state as a form to organize our living together is kind of separated. But then, and to make it really short, it really makes me think, the fragmentation we have and the experience, and this comes to the second question, the experience of people of a certain well-being is the nation state, is to live in Germany or in Australia or wherever, because this is the scale where the welfare state, not the nation state, but the experience of the welfare state was mainly organized. And that the European Union, not by chance, is very weak in this, if you like. Huh? If I live in Vienna and looking at Budapest or at Hungary or at Romania, it's very different. So I would say a second aspect to overcome not the nation state, but to overcome a principle to organize the resources, the identities at a national scale, is really to have mechanisms of distribution that are not linked so much to the competing capitalist nation state. And I end maybe this. So if we look back into the 1970s, and now we are working a bit on it, the debate on a new international economic order Yeah, 1st of May 74, the declaration of the General Assembly of the United Nations was, we need decolonization. The southern states learned that they were politically independent, but economically completely dependent. So the idea was to have binding rules, economic rules, above the nation state, which creates the opportunity not to organize the wealth, the material wealth, mainly at the national scale. I hope. So in this sense, I can imagine that we have a multi-layered institutions, belongings, the mobilization of resources, the mobilization of solidarity, which is mainly at the national level, very hierarchical, but solidarity has to do with the nation state, at least in the global north, or even more in the global north. And I would say we can overcome this. These are some thoughts. Yeah, the justice and the working class. My argument would be twofold. The first is that we have the experience again that the workers in the capitalist centers are better off as a result of their struggles. We have this in these days, the strikes. It's not that it was given by Bismarck in Germany, but it was the menace of a very strong social democracy, and then it was the trade unions that a working class can experience justice. But what happened in the neoliberal term, that the experience of justice was gone. The experience is you have to be competitive, and that the social, very different within the countries, but the social security systems, the institutionalized forms of solidarity, not only the interpersonal solidarity, the institutionalized forms of solidarity, which is the welfare state. These were weakened. And this is an experience of many people. And then comes the far right in and says, the solidarity is not any longer the social security, the materiality, it's identity. It's to create an enemy. It's the migrant, the other. Yeah. So I would say the answer to this is not to refer naively to history, but to refer to the principle of a welfare state, of an ecological welfare state, if you like, to create the rules, to create the conditions of people to live well, even in situation of crisis, which is the idea of an institutional solidarity when people are in a living crisis. Yeah, if they are ill or if they lost their job, we have institutionalized forms of a solidarity, and we need to reconstruct this, but then under the conditions of planetary boundaries. I would argue for an environmental welfare state, to take the ecological question seriously, to take the international question seriously. Yeah, it's not only Germany, it's at least the EU, it's beyond. In this sense, it could become an experience of workers, not to follow the far right. So it's only one answer here, but I think this would be to create I finish this, to create an experience of social security, which is really an experience, and not to say this is not important because the migrants are the guilty, yeah, or the globalization is guilty, yeah, the globalists are guilty. This is a part of an answer.
Thank you very much. Let's briefly move over to the virtual platform. Bernardo, I think we've got one question there. Could you perhaps just read it out for us, please?
Yeah. We have a question here from our Zoom audience, from Noor Gizem Yalcin. It says here, thank you for the inspiring talk, a backcasting kind of question. We are in year 2040. We achieved the goal of institutionalization of justice as a global norm. What kind of political rules were established? Which societal norms were created or reactivated? Who were the active actors? What was done differently to broaden the notion of environmental justice being only in the form of resistance from above?
Thank you.
Oh, also very broad question. Thank you very much. Of course, it's many answers. I would say a major principle is to have realized upper limits and lower limits, to have a really, if you like, a donut economy. A bit what I published with 27 co-authors a paper on societal limits, on societal boundaries. We complemented a bit the debate on planetary boundaries. And I would say institutionalized means not only the political rules. I focused at the end of political rules. Institutionalized means to give durability, to give a practice, to have certain practices even at the everyday life. So I would say there will be rules, even bans, not to go in a certain consumption and way of living beyond a certain threshold, but also not to be below. But this means at the level of norms that people would accept and would like to live this. Yeah, it's that I really feel comfortable when I don't have a car because I have a good public transport system. I feel comfortable that I have a diet which is healthy and not aggressive against animals or against imports of soybeans, etc., etc. So in this sense, I don't have a clear-cut answer. It's more some principles, because within these 17 years, for example, when it comes to communication, when it comes to energy supply, there will be some things we don't imagine today. But I would say at this level of principles, I can imagine upper levels, lower levels, or thresholds, if you like, of a living. As a third aspect is, I left this out in my talk, we have to, I mentioned the investment function. We have to talk about private property. We have to talk about who decides over the investment function, which is in your outline of the focal topic, the question of participation. Who participates in those decisions that are mainly or very much structuring our living together, which is not the decision in elections. Of course, elections are important, but the decisions are made when it comes to investment in infrastructures, in which kind of energy production, which kind of the production of means of transport, etc., etc. And there I would say we have to talk about ownership, about what is behind ownership. And this is a question of power, which I cannot imagine. I cannot imagine what it means to be confronted with a fossil fuel industry or a digital industry that is so powerful. How to weaken this, how to reorganize the ownership of the, if you like, the apparatus of production and reproduction of our living together, the infrastructures, etc., etc. Maybe these are some thoughts.
If I could briefly just abuse my position as facilitator here, because your last point is really fascinating also to the work that I personally do, is the deep embeddedness of corporations, specifically within the state corporate dynamic, and the role that corporations play in shaping politics, in shaping our way of living, in shaping consumer choices, exactly what you were saying. And then also as a lawyer, the role that law plays and the extent to which law is complicit in driving these sort of social, ecologically destructive corporate practices by endorsing neoliberal, pro-capitalist, pro-growth paradigms such as sustainable development, which we know now there's sufficient evidence to show that sustainable development is not a socio-ecologically friendly principle. It's not. But it's been co-opted, it's been greenwashed, it's being followed by governments, the sustainable development goals. So I would love to provoke you a little bit further in hearing what you think of corporations themselves as being possibly the biggest perpetrator and reason for the planetary calamity that we find ourselves in. Not states, but corporations, and the extent to which corporations control states and governments and politics. Thanks.
Concerning the concept of sustainability, we are here at RIFS. You have sustainability in your name of the institute. Yeah, but I agree that it's. I wrote already 30 years ago one of my first articles that I called it a container concept. Yeah, you have a kind of a core understanding, but then you have different understandings. And today it's even much more complex. But I would say, at the societal level, you can still refer to sustainability in a progressive sense, but at the same time, you have to criticize all these greenwashing activities and others. But the everyday consciousness is still sustainability for many people is mainly ecological sustainability, and it's something has to be changed. I think that the transformation debate had a time when it was more radical. Maybe today it's justice, yeah, environmental justice. But yeah, just to say this. When it comes to corporations, I think we have to distinguish, which is not so easy, between entities of production. I call it like this. There are entities of production. They produce something within society, food, but even services, transport, but also cars. This is we need for our material reproduction. But then comes an aspect which you mentioned, I mentioned, which is the logics behind this necessary production is profit making, is capital accumulation. So this is why, for example, Martha Bauer argues we need public investment, we need public enterprise. The city of Vienna still has 40% of housing is public. And you notice this in Vienna. It's a difference to Berlin. Yeah, it was not privatized public housing. So the ownership, the logics of we need houses. Yeah, we need housing. But what is the logics behind housing? Yeah, we need also housing, if you like, for different strata of society. Hopefully, we don't need huge villas and whatever, but you know what I mean, yeah? And so I would distinguish between our material reproduction through entities of production, hopefully sustainable, just, good working conditions. But then who drives this corporation or this entity of production? And this is under capitalist conditions for many, it's profit making. And this is maybe a third aspect. We need to distinguish between products that have a use value, a really use value, which is sustainable and which is for people, and products which don't have a use value. But then we come we have to judge it. Yeah, for many people, the SUV has a use value. It's cool to have an SUV. Probably for most or all of us, it doesn't have a use value, a SUV. Yeah. So then we come to political discussions. But I think maybe coming back to the question from the Zoom, we need a form to talk about needs and the fulfillment of needs. We need forms of planning also in the sense, not a centralized Politburo which plans society, but we need forms of planning, of resource planning, of a planning of the distribution of certain resources. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Let's turn again to the in-presence people before we go to virtual. Any follow-up? Yes, please. Please.
Yes, thank you for your response earlier. One follow-up maybe kind of to fit into this debate of corporations. What role do you think technology and technological innovation plays in developing this sense of justice? Because we can, of course, imagine the usually dystopian idea that AI will take over, but obviously if we want to achieve some kind of sustainable justice and allow for some kind of well-being, we also need some kind of technological transformation. So what role do you see there? Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is a difficult question. I'm not a specialist, but I would knowing a bit about critical technical studies or technology studies. I would also argue we have the production of artifacts. This is technology. Technology is an artifact. And this is also, of course, it's not only profit-driven, it's mainly profit-driven, but also, of course, we have basic science, we have engineering, we have a hard science, yeah, which is the curiosity of researchers, et cetera, et cetera. But I would argue we need a public deliberation of even the development, not only of the use, the application of the development of certain technologies, what we want. Do we need smartphones, or do we need a form of communication which is really sustainable in the sense of 99% recyclable, maybe not the individualized smartphone, etc., etc. Do we need artificial intelligence? In what sense do we need it? But it's very difficult, because what Egon Becker, a scholar from Frankfurt, from the Institute of Social Ecological Research, argued once, he called them the transformation cores, die Transformationskerne. And these transformation cores, where the new technologies are developed, are necessarily not under democratic deliberation. So this is a contradiction. We don't know which technology will be developed within the next 5 years. We should know, but we don't, because these transformation cores have a dynamic which is so speedy, yeah, and we cannot. So this is a bit the point. But I would say, at a very general level, what is a democratization of technology development, of technology application, and then again comes to judging what is good and what is not good, but to, let's say, to lower a bit the profitability focus on technology development. At least this would be an entry point. Yeah. Beside all this, the points I made.
Thank you very much, Uli. And this is certainly also a topic that's now relevant within the nuclear and the whole nuclear transition that's occurring in Germany, certainly. There's 2 questions online. The first one, thank you for a thought-provoking talk. Adding on to the previous questions, at the beginning of your talk, you emphasized the normativity of justice. Taking this into consideration, how would you then suggest to get to a universal binding framework for justice that would be perceived as just by everyone? Or differently put, whose normative claims of justice should be included into this global justice norm? And what are then the justice implications of not taking other views on justice into account? From Alviki de Boern. Thank you.
This is the point of my preparation for this talk, when I stopped reading more about Nussbaum and Zen and others, because they claim, or Rawls, but this is much older. I don't have a clear-cut answer, because then we go to procedural questions. And I would, yeah, and this is important, of course, how do we develop not only principles of justice, but also the very experience of a just society, as I said, how to move, how to live, how to have an everyday life, how I have production, how we produce. I would say the universally binding framework needs to take seriously the planetary boundaries, needs to take seriously a bottom line of a good living for people. But we cannot say positivistically, that's it. It's a car, or it's one flight per year, or it's a meat consumption per week, or whatever. But to link it to already existing experiences. I hope I get this, but I'm thinking loudly. We need to take seriously experiences of justice and claims of justice under conditions of an ecological crisis, under conditions of global injustice, but not to reduce it too early to the question of a process, participation, deliberation, and other, etc., but to have a creativity, how to develop our world and what could be a good living for all, starting from the existing. Yeah, I hope I get this point. In Potsdam, the current living conditions, or in Brandenburg, better said, because we have the countryside, the urban-rural split. Having a good living in Brandenburg for many years will be very different from a country where the spatial structures are still more condensed. You don't have to drive so much because the spatial structures here are kind of so far away, etc., etc. I hope I get this. I'm hesitating to say this is kind of the universal norm, but I'm also hesitating not to think that at some stages we have even kind of some norms of a living, as I said, not to reduce it to procedures. But yeah, I can't say more. I'm sorry about it, but it makes me think, as you saw.
Thank you very much. That certainly highlights also the complexity of the debate, doesn't it? I think we've got a bit time for 2 more questions online, and there is one that I will also again read out loud. I would be interested in your opinion on the following thought. The trend towards justice in science, that is the emphasis on a moral ethical category in a social system that is structurally deeply amoral, is maybe evidence of a modern ideology according to Zizek. They know it, but they do it anyway. Namely, that of an ideology in positivistic science, which, although everyone implicitly or unconsciously knows that ethics and morals is actually not a category, but which nevertheless makes ethics and morals strong in order not to have radically pose the question of capitalism as a social system. However, acting contrary to one's own knowledge is extremely disadvantageous for science itself. Complex question.
Yeah, I thought a lot about it. Yeah, Zizek is one, but I refer to Schandl, more publicist, not so known as Zizek. I would agree that if we start, this is also our intuition with the Imperial Mode of Living, with the book, because of course we were criticized to moralize and that the workers in the global north are guilty, etc., etc. I would say, yeah, the danger, and this was why I didn't develop further the moral philosophy argument. The danger is that you distract the debate when it comes to moral from the very social and societal conditions, the conditions of power, the conditions of exploitation, the conditions of a good living, to go into the other direction. And I don't know this Zizek arguments, but I can imagine, because I know some of his other work, that he is furious about a moral, yeah, because he says this is exactly a self-understanding of the modern bourgeois society to say, yeah, we know that it's wrong, but we do it anyway, as you said, and this is the problem. And I try to highlight this with my quote on Schandl, that the uneasiness with the existing societal relations are kind of dislocated or located to the terrain of moral. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And then bringing us right back to one of the critical points that you also made is, how do we sort of start instigating these transformations? Because this is the debate that we need to have, is the question, would you agree to demand from the EU to stop or to cancel the financialization of common goods, meaning in real life also to forbid hedge funds, to force cooperative ownership on local levels, getting back to your privatization debate that we just had, to enable long-term sustainable and fair economic thinking as an effective first step to the sort of transformations that you've been talking about and highlighting throughout your discussion?
Definitely, yes. It's a very clear point, and we would have 100 points where we are clear. It's again financialization, again the accumulation imperative, the growth imperative, the related interest and forces. I agree. But what I wanted to show in my talk is that we have many points of justice that are more ambiguous. This is why I introduced, I know Markus Materbauer quite well. I quoted him, I think, 4 times, and he's very important, but he is a trade unionist. And this is where, and I work with trade unions. I'm, of course, also a member of a trade union, but the ambiguity is that we have a long historical trajectory of struggles for social justice, and how to enhance this, how to broaden this now to environmental questions, when the social justice was precisely enabled by a capitalist growth imperative. This is the, I want to talk about these points, these more ambiguous points where we don't have the easy solutions. Of course, against financialization is no easy solution, but it's very powerful. But there, I would say we have a clear, we would have an agenda to stop financialization, which of course is very difficult. But I would like to highlight more these tiny points. Yeah, even Zizek as a psychoanalyst would say, the very subjectivity, how to change, how to have learning processes that we change the subjectivity, which is growth oriented, which is, I want to have a bit more, that my children live better off than I. What are then these tiny processes when it comes to rules, to norms, but also to everyday experiences? And among my students, political science is a bit more critical than, if you like, business administration students. Many of them have not all of them, but many of them have a model of a tiny life, to have less. Yeah, to have, when I discuss, I don't talk to all of them, but when we have time to discuss a bit and I get a bit of understanding, I'm surprised that they don't want a clear-cut career. They even say already with 22, I never want to work 40 hours, which prepares something. Yeah, which is, some say, oh, this is already the great mind shift. Yeah, I don't think it's a great mind shift, but it's an entry point where then we can push some things.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that we've run out of time. And as you can also see from the comments online, it's your wonderfully inspiring and critical thoughts have been very well received. So thank you very, very much for that. Please join me, those present and online, in thanking Uli for this. Thanks. And before we go and say goodbye to everyone, I wish also to invite you again for our next public seminar. This is on the 22nd of May. And it will be presented by Professor Ricarda Flemmer from Uni Tübingen. And she will talk about the rights of nature and their transformative potential for more sustainable futures. And that talk, as this one, are all recorded and available on YouTube on our wonderful website. Thank you everyone for being here. Have a lovely afternoon further. Thanks.